couple of years ago, when I was writing part of a book about Julius Caesar, I did a Twitter poll where I asked people, do you think Julius Caesar was rightfully assassinated as a tyrant or brutally murdered? And 25% said they thought he was rightfully assassinated and kind of empathised with the conspirators, and 54% said that they thought he had been brutally and unfairly murdered, which I think is really interesting in terms of his legacy.
Some historians tend to consider Julius Caesar a dictator or a tyrant, in a sense, a sort of right-wing figure. But on the other side, Julius Caesar is a very important social reformer. It's a very complicated figure. It's not easy to define him.
Even to people who follow me, a person who never talks about war, he is seen as a good leader of some kind and somebody who did not deserve to die, rather than a tyrant who had taken over the Republic and made himself a monarch and who had left his opposition with no other option than to kill him.
Julius Caesar was a typical representative of the most noble families of Rome. Caesar and his family actually boasted an origin from the goddess Venus herself. That's why Julius Caesar was called Divus, like the divine Julius Caesar.
A large part of his career is a traditional Roman politician with a traditional Roman career. He starts by being a priest. He buys his way into his first offices.
Members of the family of Julius Caesar were consuls, in the early republic, so they had a long tradition, in politics. But Julius Caesar had a very difficult start, because when he was a young man, the politician who took the power in Rome at the time was Sulla, who was an enemy of the family of Julius Caesar. So members of the family of Julius Caesar were actually banished from Rome, their properties were confiscated.
He was put on a kill list, basically, and had to run away from Rome and join the army. He doesn't join as like a foot soldier, he's not like sharp. He joins kind of mid-level, and his real skill is being amazing at war, which is a terrible and terrifying skill. And then he comes back to Rome with all of the money that he gets by plundering places that Romans are plundering, and starts his political career again.
In comparison with other politicians of the time, like Crassus and Pompey, Julius Caesar had a slow coming into power.
He generally does Roman politics like everybody else is doing Roman politics, which is bribe the hell out of everybody, do whatever you need to do to get ahead of everybody else, try to pay your way into popularity. He is in the populares faction, so there's two factions at this point, the optimates, who believe in the innate superiority of the aristocratic classes, and then there's the populares.
Julius Caesar actually belonged to this party who tried to support the lower classes or the middle class of Rome, which was impoverished at that time.
They will take their power by kind of geeing up the masses. They will give them bread and circuses, and then they will incite them to riot whenever they feel like they need to. He is one of the more corrupt and just really astoundingly corrupt politicians. He brags quite happily about the fact that he will bribe anybody. Eventually he works his way up.
Around 60 before Christ, he made a triumvirate with Pompeius and Crassus, who were the most important politicians at the time. That's when Julius Caesar started to become a central figure in Roman politics, not before that period. And then, just after that, he received the governorship of Gaul.
He gets to go off to Gaul, which is a really big commission.
That's when Julius Caesar started his ascension, into power, because he was able to conquer in a very short time an extremely large territory in the north of Italy, which is more or less what is today France and Switzerland, part of Belgium and part of Germany.
He goes off, just absolutely plunders it, practically genocides the people. He just wipes out almost the entire culture. He claims that he killed 1 million people and enslaved 1 million more, which is one a hell of a thing to brag about.
He was able to cross the channel. He went into Britain for the first time. He was the first Roman to do that.
And then he turned around and looked at Rome. Pompey was his only competition at that time.
He was asked to relinquish the command of his armies and to return to the status of, let's say, private citizen. But Julius Caesar didn't accept this. So he tried to find a compromise with the Roman authorities, saying that if he was to relinquish his command over his armies, also Pompey had to relinquish his command. But the Roman authorities and the Senate didn't accept this.
He saw his enemies in Rome who were all saying that when he gave up his commission, he would be prosecuted for all of the terrible things that he had done, for all of the bribery, for all of the ways in which he had corrupted the state. So Julius decides that he does not want to be prosecuted. He does not believe that he should be prosecuted. He thinks he's right about everything all the time. His basic thought is, I brought you all of this glory and land. How dare you try to prosecute me for anything? So he says, if you don't promise you won't prosecute me, I am going to march on Rome. They say, that's ridiculous. The entire foundation of the Republic is that everybody is held accountable for their actions. And so he says, all right, and he takes his army and he marches across the Rubicon.
Julius Caesar was forced to cross the Rubicon, the famous, the die is cast, or whatever you want to say about that.
The full quote of the die is cast is, these actions are because of what the gods have decided and what the Senate have forced me to do. The die is cast. And he claims that they made him do it.
Finally, Julius Caesar was able to defeat Pompey.
Pompey has no army, so him and the Senate have to flee. Caesar chases them around basically the entire empire, eventually beats them. Pompey is killed in Egypt, at which point Caesar comes back to Rome, says, well done me, I saved us all from a civil war, aren't I good? I'm dictator now. Caesar is an autocratic leader from the very beginning. His first consulship, that's supposed to be a shared position where there's two consuls and they have to agree on everything. And people joked about the fact that Caesar just did what he wanted. He's a massive micromanager. Every part of the state, he is into it and he is fiddling about. When he comes back as a dictator and he decides he's going to redo the calendar in his own image and name a month after himself, like, that is unbelievably autocratic. And he never learns at any point that what all the Romans really want from him is to pretend that he's taking their opinion into account. In both the Roman sense of the word, in that he had the job, and in our modern sense of the word, he is a complete dictator.
He was also a military leader. That's what makes him look a little bit like a tyrant sometimes. This is the idea that Julius Caesar is the one who abolished the Roman Republic, and brought the Roman system from a democratic sort of system into a sort of monarchic system, which is the Roman Empire. But actually, the republic was a republic for the rich man. It was not a republic for the lower classes, So at least Julius Caesar was reforming society. So he was a progressive social leader from that point of view. There are some politicians who actually have affinities with Julius Caesar. The American great reformers, let's say Lincoln and Kennedy, both of them, they had ideas which were similar about society, at least.
He just thinks he's right about everything. He just is like, well, I'm right and I've got the best idea and I don't really care what anybody else thinks, so I'm just going to do it and then I'll tell you about it afterwards, which is the worst possible thing he could have been. And that, more than anything, is his problem and what gets him killed, which is that he won't allow anybody else the dignity and honour of the possibility that they might also have a say in how the state is run.
Julius Caesar was taking away freedom from the leading class, which is actually their privileges. I was giving it to the lower classes actually. So these people liked Caesar actually.
Because Caesar is such an autocratic leader, but also terrifying and quite popular among the people, certainly of Rome, he keeps getting voted massive amounts of honours, which scare people. Particularly, they scare the other senators who see him being put higher and higher and higher on a pedestal. He has voted things like the right to call himself the father of the country, the right to wear his laurel leaves all the time, and his triumphal robes. He has a statue among the old kings, and a statue of him is carried amongst the gods in processions. Sacrifices are made in his name. He is beginning to have himself put on a pedestal which is above mortals, and that is very frightening.
And that's when Julius Caesar was actually appointed as a permanent dictator.
In February 44, he makes himself dictator for life, and he takes away the possibility that they are ever going to get rid of him.
A dictator was somebody who was in power only in an emergency and only for the time of an emergency.
Every previous dictator had it for a year, had it for 2 years, and then stepped down.
They believed that Julius Caesar was introducing into Rome a new monarchy. You know that the first phase of Roman history was monarchic, with the kings, but then these kings were driven out, and the Romans couldn't accept the idea that a king was coming back.
And then there's a very famous incident at the Lupercalia, which involves all of the most prominent men running nude through the city, hitting women with sticks. But it ends with them all arriving in the Forum, and Mark Antony, who is his right-hand man, pulls out of somewhere. And I always like to think this because he's nude, he's completely naked, so where has he got it? He pulls out a crown and offers it to Caesar. Someone puts it on his head, and he waits to see how the crowd reacts. And eventually they're kind of against it, so he says, oh no, I won't be a king. But they see him with a crown on, and they have seen him acting as a monarch. And it seems like there is going to be no possible way that anything is going to go back to normal. And so people who opposed him in the past and people who were friends of his decide that something has to be done. And the only thing that can be done is to assassinate him. There is no other course of action. The three main conspirators are two people who were previously his enemies.
These were Brutus and Cassius, who had been fighting against Caesar originally in the Battle of Pharsalus.
They were strong supporters of Pompey, and they had been forgiven by Caesar.
Julius Caesar also gave them some important positions in his government.
Caesar, for all his many, many flaws, he was not a cruel man. And he was kind to his enemies. This is possibly a reason why you shouldn't forgive people who have fought against you in a war. And then the third is the Brutus, whose name is Decimus Junius Brutus. And he has been a supporter of Caesar's, a lieutenant of Caesar's since the beginning. But when the dictator for life thing happens, when he starts to see crowns, people start calling on his supposed ancestor, who's the Brutus who overthrew the kings, and he feels somehow that he can no longer support Caesar. Assassination has become a legitimate political tool in Rome by this point for about 100 years. He's about to go to Parthia, and people start talking very seriously about how they're going to get rid of him, and there's a suggestion that they could push him off a bridge, which is quite good. There's a suggestion they could get a mob to attack him after he's been pushed off a bridge, just in case that doesn't work. Someone suggests that they could get him at the games because he will be out of his litter and walking around, so they could get gladiators to kill him. Eventually they decide that they are going to do it in the Senate while there is a Senate meeting, because one, they kind of hope that other senators might join in. Two, they want to make it clear that this is a political act act, not a personal act, that this is an act to save the Republic. And 3, it is a time when he will not be suspicious when people approach him, and they will be wearing their massive togas, and if they're wearing it, nobody will be able to spot that they've got swords underneath them. It's both ideological and practical decision to kill him in the Senate.
The actual assassination of Julius Caesar happened on March the 15th.
On the day of the assassination, which is the Ides of March 44 BCE.
The conspirators actually took this occasion to kill Julius Caesar because Julius Caesar actually was about to leave Rome. His intention was to go to Alexandria in Egypt and begin a new campaign into the Middle East to conquer a new territory, through actually Mesopotamia and Persia, and probably to extend into India, because one of the main plans of Julius Caesar was that of rebuilding the empire of Alexander the Great.
Caesar has called a Senate meeting, and they've all decided that this is going to be the best time to do it, because if Caesar's called it, then he'll definitely be there. There are quite a lot of omens leading up. During the night, Calpurnia, who's his wife, has dreams that he's going to die or that the house is going to fall down. Caesar is looking like he's not going to go to the Senate that day because Romans are very religious, and even Caesar gets put off by a lot of bad dreams and auguries. And in 2 of the accounts that we've got, he's also been warned by a soothsayer that something bad is going to happen to him on the Ides of March. Eventually Decimus Brutus turns up and persuades him to go, and says, everybody's waiting for you, you've called this, we've not got much time, we need to sort stuff out. So he goes along.
We are now very close to the location of Julius Caesar assassination in Largo Argentina. What we are seeing now are the so-called Republican temples of Largo Argentina, which were actually brought to light during the fascist regime era around 1926-27. So all these buildings which are visible now don't belong to the complex of buildings where Julius Caesar was assassinated. These buildings were actually in front of the theater of Pompey, which was an extremely complex series of buildings, including a semi-open space with roof and columns but without walls, which was the place where the Senate was meeting. We need to move to the area behind to see the location of the assassination of Julius Caesar.
The person who's called the Senate meeting has to do a sacrifice to make sure that the gods are okay with this meeting happening, and the gods are not okay with it. According to some of the later sources that we have, the sacrifice has no heart, which is a very bad sign. And he looks like he's going to go home again, and Brutus again has to convince him to go in and say, look, you're Caesar, what do you care about the gods, basically.
It seems that Mark Antony was kept outside the Senate House because they were afraid that he could actually help Caesar.
He does enter. He goes and sits in his big fancy chair. A guy called Tullius Cimbra grabs Caesar. He starts by asking for mercy for his brother, who Caesar has unilaterally exiled for whatever reason. Caesar brushes him off, so he grabs Caesar's toga. No one has touched Caesar without his permission for many, many years, and he is unhappy about that. Some of the sources say that he is grabbing the toga to hold him down in his seat, and some say that he is doing it to expose his neck, because what happens next, a guy called Servilius Casca stabs him. He either stabs him from behind and it comes in here into his shoulder, or he stabs him and it comes in kind of here. This is where the accounts split off slightly. Everybody agrees that Casca is the first person to stab and it's somewhere in the neck area, but Caesar's reaction changes quite a lot depending on really whether sources liked him or not. The earliest version was written about 20 or 30 years later by a guy called Nicolaus of Damascus, who was writing for Octavian, who is Julius Caesar's heir. He tells quite a detailed version where as soon as he's stabbed, Caesar jumps up and is immediately piled on. He doesn't have a chance to react, he doesn't do anything, he is just immediately knocked to the ground and is stabbed all over about 30 times, and he says that it looks like a brawl where all of the conspirators are fighting over hitting Caesar's body. He's quite specific and says that he's stabbed in the side, that Decimus Brutus hits him in the thigh, and that Cassius swipes him across the face. And then he falls to the ground and is stabbed by a frenzy of people trying to all stab him as much as possible. The second version is Suetonius, who is writing a biography of Julius Caesar about 150 years later, about 100 CE, and he says that as soon as Caesar is stabbed, he stabs Casca's hand with his stylus. So while Casca still has his dagger stuck in him, he stabs his hand. He then tries to jump up, but because he sees how many people are pulling swords and daggers out, he loses heart and his focus becomes on trying to maintain his dignity. So he tries to cover his head, he tries to cover his legs. What he says is in Greek, kai su teknon, which means you too, my son. And then he dies kind of covering himself as like a little huddled animal. The third version is Plutarch, who's writing about the same time as Suetonius. It's about 150 years later. He's writing a biography of Julius Caesar and trying to make it a parallel to Alexander the Great. In his version, Caesar basically says, what the fuck? Basically, what the hell are you doing? And he's furious, and he holds onto the dagger that is stuck into him, which causes Casca to have to call for help. In this version, Caesar is surrounded but fights back really hard until Brutus stabs him in the groin, at which point he goes down, and then when he sees Decimus Brutus, that's when he loses heart and he pulls his toga over his head and gives up. The fourth version comes from Appian, who is writing about 180 years later and is writing a history of the civil wars of the late Republic. And in this version, which is my favourite version, Caesar grabs Casca as he stabs him and throws him across the room. And as he throws him, he leaves his side open and he is stabbed through the side. He then repeats what Suetonius says, which is that he's stabbed in the thigh by Brutus and he's stabbed in the face by Cassius, and that he is thrown around. He's described as a wild beast. He sees that Decimus Brutus has a knife and he loses heart, he covers his face and he goes down. The interesting thing, I think, about all of those different versions is only in one that he speaks. And he says in Greek, you too, my child, not in Latin. But in all of the rest of them, he's silent.
According to a very recent article, scholars made the hypothesis that the actual spot where Julius Caesar was wounded, mortally wounded by the conspirators is actually this bus stop here. We have to imagine that the Curia of Pompey, this space in which they had the meetings of the Senate, was actually located across the street here. Not much of the ancient spot is visible today, but this is the actual location of the assassination.
Immediate aftermath of it is that the city is kind of shocked.
There was an extreme confusion in Rome.
They don't really know what to do or how to function without Caesar.
The supporters of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony and Lepidus, were, it seems, very afraid of being assassinated themselves. So it seems that they actually went into hiding.
But it very much seems like everything is going to gradually continue as normal and that the conspirators are going to get what they wanted.
The supporters of Julius Caesar, they decided to forgive the killers of Julius Caesar, but at the same time to keep all the, well, let's say, plans that Julius Caesar had set, for its government.
Mark Antony eventually gets the Senate to agree that they will give him a state funeral. There is quite a lot of argument about whether they should remember him as a tyrant who was killed and therefore try to cut his memory out of Roman history, or whether they should remember him as the Pontifex Maximus, the head priest, and the dictator of Rome who was killed, and therefore give him a state funeral and act like it was a tragedy. Eventually they come to a sort of truce where they will give him this state funeral, but they won't make too much of a fuss after that.
But later on, at the funeral of Julius Caesar, according to the historians, Mark Antony gave a speech which actually raised, the rage of the crowd.
Mark Antony does rile everybody up by showing everybody his toga at the funeral, covered in blood, which kind of annoys people.
So Brutus and Cassius, they were actually driven out of Rome.
And then what happens is a couple of months afterwards, this guy comes to town called Gaius Octavianus, and he says, I am Julius Caesar's great nephew. He adopted me in his will. I have all of his money and all of his power. He says he's going to take revenge. Octavian is 19 years old, and he basically marches into Rome and says, I'm not standing for this. I'm going to raise my own army and take them to war against Brutus and Cassius. They say, you can't do that, you're not a consul, you're not allowed an army. He says, all right, make me consul. And literally sends in men with swords into the Senate house, and they say, we will literally kill you if you don't make him consul. And then Octavian rampages across the empire. He chases Cassius and Brutus and the other conspirators, and he is the person who is willing to completely destroy everything that Rome technically stands for in order to, one, take vengeance, and two, increase his own power and authority. And that really is what brings down the Republic. It's usually said that it's Caesar's murder that ends the Republic, but Octavian, who later becomes Augustus and then becomes the first emperor, has no time or patience and is genuinely terrifying, and he completely destroys the Republic.
This emphasis on the assassination of Julius Caesar actually derives from, first of all, from the sources, all written at a later stage. Also in the literature, Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, all the action now is centered on the assassination of Julius Caesar, and that's why we have this idea, that the assassination is actually so important in his life. But I don't think that's what actually fixes his legacy. It's much more, his activity as a politician. Probably at the time of Julius Caesar, they didn't feel anything like that.
Caesar's legacy is secured by the fact that he adopts Octavian, and it's Octavian's ability to come in after the assassination and take vengeance, which really shapes how we see Julius Caesar today, because Octavian is obviously very successful. He destroys everybody who tries to stand up to him. He destroys Cassius and Brutus, and then he destroys Antony as well. And because of that, he's the winner, and he gets to say who is the baddie and who is the goodie. He makes Caesar a god, a literal god. There's a whole thing about a comet going up and somebody saying that that's Caesar's soul. So he is made literally divine. Then Octavian shapes his entire identity around the fact that he is the son of the divine murdered Julius Caesar, and he is able to create this whole story whereby Caesar is the sadly murdered victim.
In the end, the leadership of Julius Caesar, or the ideas of Julius Caesar, survived through Octavian. His ideas as as a new political leader actually prevailed in Rome.
Caesar's writings of himself as the great military commander of Rome mean that he is an idol to military dictators, basically, the kind of people who want to civilize the world and make themselves the master of the universe. He is an idol to people like Napoleon.
Napoleon was also a social reformer. He was influenced by the ideas of the French Revolution and was a very important military leader, but he was defeated, something that didn't happen to Julius Caesar. He was never defeated in battle. Only people who were organizing a conspiracy against him were able to kill him.
They don't heed the warning, though. They never seem to get to the end of the story, which is that everybody hated him and then they stabbed him to death. Largely because he portrays himself so well in his writings that it seems impossible that that could happen to him. So he wrote 2 books, and they were considered to be, by everybody, even people who hated Caesar as a person, perfect examples of Latin literature. And even down to today, you will find A-level or GCSE Latin students in nice schools around the country reading Caesar's Gallic War and coming to know Caesar only as the way that he portrayed himself. He presents himself in the third person as an untouchable genius, and because of that, he is able to shape his own legacy into the modern day as not as a genocidal leader who completely rampages over entire civilizations in order to advance his own personal goals in Rome, but as a glorious and brilliant military leader who brings civilization to the savages. And that is still the legacy that he has today, largely because he's really good at writing Latin. I've had a lot of people talking to me about Julius Caesar because the main way that he took sole power was by refusing to give up when he had come to the end of his term. And what he did instead was send in an army to create violence in the centre of Rome in order to make sure that he didn't have to. And we have just seen that happen on a much, much smaller scale with the Senate riots in America and the refusal of Trump to admit that he lost an election. And had Trump had more of a terrifying ego and a backbone, then we might have seen something much, much worse. For the people who lived through what Caesar was doing, he did the Senate riots on a scale of 1 million. He took a trained army into Rome so that he didn't have to give up his power and give it to somebody else who legitimately owned it. Everything that you think is stable and holds a state or an empire together is actually very, very fragile. It only takes one person to refuse to play by the rules to show that it is based on agreement that the rules matter.
Julius Caesar may appear as a dictator, as a military commander, so in a sense, a sort of right-wing figure, because he imposed his ideas with his military power. But on the other side, Julius Caesar was a social reformer who introduced a lot of new ideas in Roman society. So from this point of view, Julius Caesar actually appeared to be like a progressive leader today. He's somewhere in the middle. If I have to say my personal opinion, I think in the end Julius Caesar is mostly a progressive leader. His attitude with his soldiers was extremely democratic, something that other leaders didn't do before him, and the soldiers loved him. Julius Caesar actually relied on the people from the lower classes.
He, in my opinion, is a dangerous figure to idolize because the main thing about Julius Caesar is he does what he wants when he wants to, and he doesn't care what anybody else thinks about him. He cannot be constrained by the normal rules of political or religious or moral behavior.
It's a very complex, complicated figure. It's not easy to define him, in a way or another.
Nobody had ever reigned over such a huge territory and then died at such a young age. So his death and burial are among the most important events from anywhere in the ancient world.
The likes of Perdiccas, Ptolemy, and they want to succeed Alexander the Great. They want to be like him. They want to be really, really powerful. And they now see those generals who they'd once served alongside as potential obstacles.
Perhaps more people have looked for the tomb and the body than have looked for just about any other so-called missing monument in Egypt. This 2-year stalemate where nobody knows what's going to happen.
And this sparks one of the most remarkable, if not the most remarkable heist in the whole of history. So in early 323 BC, Alexander the Great, he's 32 years old and he's forged one of the largest empires the world had yet seen, stretching from Greece to the Indus River Valley.
He ruled over a territory which in total was probably greater than any ruler anywhere in ancient history had ruled. He had come to conquer Greece, of course, Anatolia, Egypt, the Near East, and he'd ventured into India, not entirely successfully, but nonetheless he had conquered some territory there too. And at the point of his death, he had returned to Babylon. He was in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II there, reigning over as great an empire as had ever existed.
It's really interesting in early to mid 323 BC, the last days, the last week or so of Alexander's life. We have various accounts of what happens to Alexander during this time, but there's an interesting account that survives in a couple of our sources from the royal journals. And it really starts with this event. Alexander, it's the evening of some day, and he's invited by one of his companions to a drinking party, the drinking party of Medius of Larissa. Alexander goes to the drinking party, he has a good time, he then goes back home, he goes to sleep, and the next day he develops a fever. And over the next few days, this fever gets worse and worse and worse, and ultimately he's consigned to his bed in the royal palace. Alexander then becomes mute, and he can't do any more issuing of instructions, issuing of sacrifices, anything like that. He's really near death's door. At this time, you had the soldiers of Alexander the Great. They burst into the chamber. They demand to see Alexander. Alexander famously, the soldiers file past him. He gives the nod. He gives a wave or something, this mute acknowledgement of their presence. There have been many theories put forward as to how Alexander died, or what was the cause of his death. There have been theories about disease, about malaria, about typhoid. But you've also got to remember that Alexander suffered several severe wounds during his campaigns. He was smashed in the head and the neck by a catapult bolt. He was also punctured in the lung by an arrow when campaigning in India. So perhaps part of the reason for his early death was caused by all of these wounds catching up on him, perhaps combined with his heavy drinking. There might also be an element of grief in there too. Alexander the previous year had lost his closest companion, his lover Hephaestion.
There is an alternative version of events in which something he drank, some dodgy wine perhaps, led to him suffering for a few days, eventually in agony, and this leads to his death. The suspicion in that case is that he was poisoned.
This was put forward by one particular family many years later, aiming to demonize a rival, a hostile faction. And what better way to do it than to say, hey, you murdered Alexander the Great. But the idea that he was poisoned is almost certainly not true.
In any case, he seems to have been suffering from something for a number of days.
And ultimately, on the 11th of June, there's some debate whether it's the 10th or the 11th. I'm more swayed by that. It was the 11th of June. In the late afternoon, early evening, Alexander, he's surrounded by his 7 most important subordinates, and he breathes his last. Alexander the Great is dead at the age of 32.
At At the time of his death, there was no clear heir to his empire, which meant there was a great question about who was going to take over, whether there would be a single person to take over all of his territories or whether they would become divided. And there were a number of candidates. Two of the most important of these are Perdiccas and Ptolemy.
When Alexander dies, Perdiccas is Alexander's highest ranking subordinate in Babylon. He's Alexander's second in command. So much authority does Perdiccas have when Alexander dies that there's a story, and I believe it is true, that a couple of days before Alexander dies, he's mute at this time, but he does a very significant action because he hands Perdiccas his signet ring. Of all of his bodyguards there, he hands it to Perdiccas. Now, this wasn't to say, Perdiccas, I'm naming you my successor, but it was to say, Perdiccas, you're the most important figure in the army in Babylon. It is your responsibility, it is your job to oversee the succession of my empire.
Ptolemy, on the other hand, was at his side at the time Alexander marched through the desert in Egypt, one of the most perilous, potentially treacherous journeys that he made in his entire campaign. So both of them has a claim to being very close to Alexander, very much a part of the inner circle. They're both very capable military leaders in their own right. They are both, therefore, very good candidates to take over.
But because Alexander's done this action where he's given Perdiccas his signet ring, I think he's made it very clear that Perdiccas holds more authority than Ptolemy in the immediate aftermath of Alexander the Great's death. And this sparks animosity between Perdiccas and Ptolemy very quickly. So not long after Alexander the Great's death, there is a settlement reached in Babylon, and Ptolemy receives Egypt, a very, very strategic and important posting. Perdiccas is named as regent. Now this nominally means, because Perdiccas is regent, that Ptolemy is subordinate to Perdiccas. He ultimately is inferior to Perdiccas' command. But Ptolemy makes it very clear from early on, when he's governor of Egypt, that he has no intention of listening to any of Perdiccas' orders or abiding by Perdiccas' authority. He expands his control, he assassinates his number two, who was more friendly to Perdiccas, shall we say, and he starts building up his forces. So straight away, between 323 and 321, the animosity between Perdiccas and Ptolemy in Egypt only deepens. Alexander dies in Babylon, and his body remains there ultimately for 2 years.
It is very curious that the way that Alexander's body is treated after his death does seem to be heavily influenced by the Egyptian way of doing things. His body is essentially embalmed, it's mummified, it's preserved in the way that Egyptian bodies had been treated and been mummified for centuries. It's also then placed inside what we're told is a hammered gold kind of coffin, which again very much recalls an Egyptian way of doing things. It's certainly not the Macedonian tradition of cremating the body. And it's very interesting to think that of all the places that Alexander conquered, all the places that he has an influence in, it would be Egypt that apparently influences this crucial phase of his life and his story, his death and burial. He did visit Egypt, of course. We know that he was very impressed, particularly by the Egyptian people's devotion to their gods, their piety. So perhaps it isn't such a great surprise that Egypt should apparently be so influential, especially when we consider what's going to happen to the body when it eventually does move and it does find a more permanent home.
Now you need to remember with Alexander, as soon as he dies, Perdiccas and many of the other generals, many of the soldiers, they consider Alexander basically divine. And so Perdiccas, he spends lavishly on what is going to carry Alexander the Great's body to its eventual destination. And this is a creation unlike any other. It takes 2 years to complete, but it's basically this huge, incredible looking funeral cart.
Adorned with precious materials of all kinds. It appears to have been a sort of kind of classical building in its own right.
And they get the best craftsmen from across the empire, the best wheelsmiths to help create this incredible ancient mausoleum.
There are very elaborate descriptions of this in the classical sources, and clearly it was a very, very important part of the preparations.
So So this is the description of the funeral carriage which survives in Diodorus, probably originally from someone like Hieronymus of Cardia, an eyewitness of the carriage. And he begins his description with this. The carriage was built to reflect Alexander's glory. They started by making a casket of hammered gold, the right size to accommodate the body. And they filled the inside of it with aromatics which had the property of both imparting a sweet smell to the corpse and preserving it. Over the casket was draped a magnificent piece of purple cloth, embroidered with gold, beside which they placed the dead man's weapons. Their intention was that the overall appearance should reflect what he had accomplished in his lifetime. Next, they brought up the carriage that was to transport this casket. It was topped by a golden vault, the surface of which was studded with precious stones. On top of the vault, in the middle of the roof, exposed to the open air, there was a stylized palm tree bearing a large golden olive wreath, which shone with a bright and scintillating light when struck by the sun's rays, so that from a long way off, it looked like a flash of lightning. The carriage had 4 shafts, and each shaft had 4 rows of yokes, with 4 mules harnessed to each yoke, making a total of 64 mules. Each mule wore a golden crown. Golden bells hung down either cheek, and around their necks were collars studded with precious stones. We're not exactly sure when, but it's been estimated roughly around August-September 321 BC. The funeral carriage sets off from Babylon, and not on its own. You have the escort commanded by Aridaeus, the Macedonian commander. The funeral carriage makes its way westwards towards the eastern Mediterranean, and we're told that as it approached every village, they could hear it coming. All these bells, which were on the mules, also on the funeral carriage themselves, would announce the visit, the arrival of Alexander's funeral carriage far in advance, but also the glistening, the glinting of all of the gold. And we're told that villages just emptied. They emptied because people went onto the streets because they wanted to get a glimpse of this funeral carriage. So this funeral carriage, unlike anything anyone would have seen before, it amazes all who laid eyes upon it.
It's not entirely clear where Alexander's body was intended to be going at the point it left Babylon. We are told by certain sources that Alexander himself had expressed a wish to be buried with the oracle of Ammon in the Siwa oasis in the western desert in Egypt.
This had been where Alexander had been declared the son of Zeus Ammon many, many years earlier. But Perdiccas has no intention of the body going to Siwa, because who is the closest Macedonian official to Alexander's body if it goes to Siwa? Whose territory has it got to pass? His arch rival, Ptolemy's. It's his worst nightmare if it falls into Ptolemy's hands. Now, Perdiccas, he wants to now have control of the funeral carriage. He wants it with his royal army in Pisidia, because he wants to take the funeral carriage back to the ancestral homelands of Macedonia and bury it with the other royal kings of Macedon. Perdiccas hopes by doing that, he will become really Alexander's true successor. He's also received an offer of marriage from Alexander the Great's only full sister, Cleopatra. So he'd return to Macedonia probably as the husband of Alexander's sister, greeted by Alexander's mother, in control of the half-brother of Alexander the Great, in control of the son of Alexander the Great. Just think of that all combined with Perdiccas burying Alexander's body at the royal tombs at Aigai at Vergina. He'd be unstoppable. He'd be unbeatable. He would be the clear successor.
By contrast with Perdiccas, Ptolemy has quite different intentions. He, we understand, was not interested in taking over Alexander's empire in its entirety. He wanted to focus on Egypt and the surrounding territories, which he wanted to claim for himself. One of the reasons for his particular closeness to Alexander is connected with Alexander's time in Egypt. So perhaps it was at this point that Ptolemy decided, this is the territory for him. If he can be the person who takes final responsibility for the burial. Then he puts himself in pole position as the inheritor of at least a part of Alexander's empire. And if he can make that burial in Egypt, then that gives Egypt a very particular significance in the whole story of Alexander and the succession, and also his own story. That would, in short, secure for him, for Ptolemy, the territory that he is after.
So Ptolemy, his main aim in 321 BC is to make sure that the funeral carriage, that Alexander the Great's body, does not reach central Anatolia, central Turkey. In many ways, he has no choice, because he knows if he gets there, Perdiccas will become too powerful, and it would only be a matter of time before Perdiccas turned on him and evicted him, probably by the spear, from control of Egypt. So although he may have originally agreed that they would bury the body at Siwa, Perdiccas has no intention of it going that way. But Ptolemy has predicted this many, many months in advance. Ptolemy has been colluding with key figures in Babylon, particularly Aridaeus, the man in charge of the escort, that regardless of what orders Perdiccas sends, that he's going to take the body at first, probably to Siwa, but ultimately it's going to go through Egypt. Unknown to Perdiccas, when he sends these new orders to Aridaeus, little does he know that Aridaeus is already in cahoots with Ptolemy about taking the body to Egypt no matter what. And this sparks one of the most remarkable, if not the most remarkable, heist in the whole of history. So imagine you're in Perdiccas' shoes at this time. You've sent those new orders to Babylon, to Aridaeus, to say, hey, you're not going to take the body any longer to the south of the Mediterranean, you're not going to take it to Siwa, it's definitely not going past Egypt, you're going to take it to me in central Turkey. Imagine the shock when he later hears that as Aridaeus has approached Syria, he has changed course. Rather than continuing west, he's turned south and is currently now progressing through Syria. Imagine the panic, the anger of Perdiccas hearing that this funeral carriage is edging its way very, very closely towards Egypt. Now, this funeral carriage, even with the best suspension, this is a mini temple on wheels really, it's not going to be going very fast. So Perdiccas, although he's hundreds of miles to the west, he reacts quickly. He gathers a small force, light-armed force of some of his key subordinates, sons of a figure called Andromenes. They're called Attalus and Polymon. And they lead a rescue, a retrieval force, as it were, and they hurry at full sprint through Anatolia, across the Taurus Mountains, and down through Syria to catch up with this funeral carriage and make sure that they turn it around and it heads towards Anatolia. So they go past the Taurus Mountains, they go past Damascus, and they reach the funeral carriage. But they're greeted by a very, very bad sign, because by that time, Ptolemy once again has predicted the move. Rather than waiting for the funeral carriage to reach Egypt, Ptolemy has gathered a large army, well, a sizable mercenary army probably, and he's headed up towards Syria. He's greeted the funeral carriage when it reached the city of Damascus. According to the sources, they say that Ptolemy arrived with his army to give the funeral carriage the military welcome it deserved for housing the body of such an incredible conqueror. In reality, it was probably just to protect his winnings from Perdiccas' counterattack. And this is what it does. They reach the carriage, but they are unable to gain control of it because it has been substantially reinforced by Ptolemy's new army. They give up and they run back to Perdiccas in central Turkey to let him know, we failed. The body, the funeral carriage, is currently on its way to Egypt. You're going to have to deal with this. This is a huge blow.
We know that Ptolemy is intending to take the funerary procession to Egypt. Ultimately, he takes it to Memphis. There are a number of reasons why he might have chosen Memphis to do this. It is the capital city of Egypt. It was also fortified. That's important because Ptolemy was probably anticipating that he would face some resistance. In other words, Perdiccas would eventually catch up with him, which he almost did.
Interestingly enough, we now never hear of this incredible funeral carriage again, because it really emphasizes how, yes, as amazing as this funeral carriage was all this gold, with all the time and effort put into it, the real treasure was the body itself.
even at the point at which Ptolemy had arrived in Memphis, he wasn't safe. And indeed, we know that Perdiccas did chase Ptolemy into Egypt.
Ptolemy, by doing this, has taken the keystone, ripped it out of Perdiccas' plan for his own imperial ambitions, to return to Macedonia to bury the body of Alexander the Great. So Perdiccas, he needs to react, and he's going to react. He's going to Egypt straight away. Ptolemy needs to be dealt with.
So Perdiccas arrived in the northeastern part of the country at the city of Pelusium.
They reach Pelusium, the gateway to Egypt, and the easternmost branch of the Nile Delta.
At a point at which one of the branches of the Nile disperses into the ocean, only to find that there was a fortified garrison there opposing him, so he needed to journey up this branch of the Nile to try and find another crossing point. He tried to get across the river in the region of another city called Tanis, but again found he was opposed. He eventually made his way all the way to Memphis to try to cross there.
So right opposite Memphis, if you look at the maps, particularly the ancient maps, there's a large island. So here he decides he's going to cross, he's going to get to Memphis, he's going to get the body. Great. But it all goes horribly wrong. Perdiccas begins the crossing. It's deeper, it's a faster flowing current here. So to sort the issue, he puts his elephants upriver to slow the current, to make it easier to cross. And this works really well for the start. So about 2,000 to 3,000 of his Macedonian soldiers, his veterans, his key troops, get across to the island. What they don't know is what's happening underwater, because the elephants are moving the soil. As they're trampling around upriver, the soil's being displaced, the river gets deeper, the current gets faster, and soon enough, the crossing is no longer a crossing. It's too fast flowing, it's too dangerous. So he's now got this nightmare situation. Part of his army is on the island, part of it is back with him on the eastern bank. And then he sees another problem, because he sees Ptolemy's army approaching. And so he does this catastrophic decision. He orders his soldiers on the island to swim back. They oblige, they go into the fast-flowing current, and thousands, maybe as many as 2,000, drown. 1,000 of which have the worst fate of all, because they are sent down river. They are eaten by crocodiles.
Perdiccas' forces, by this time, having made a very long and arduous journey from Babylon to Egypt, were beginning to get demoralised. Perdiccas eventually wasn't able to keep his troops heavy enough to stop them from killing him.
And the commanders under Perdiccas, they decide enough is enough. They go to his tent and they assassinate him.
So they did Ptolemy's work for him in the end.
And that is the end of Perdiccas.
Now that the threat from Perdiccas has finally been neutralised, Perdiccas is out of the picture, Ptolemy can now concentrate on burying the body of Alexander.
Ptolemy, having defeated Perdiccas, the body is almost now his spear-won possession, alongside the whole province, alongside the whole region of Egypt. And so there's no demand for the body to be handed over. It is now with Ptolemy in Egypt. And what's interesting there's not even a demand that the body be sent on to Siwa, to the oracle of Zeus Ammon at Siwa. It's just going to stay in Egypt, in Ptolemy's possession.
It also means that Egypt is going to occupy a very, very important position in Alexander's story, and then in the whole myth of Alexander and his empire from this point onwards. The sources suggest that the body is buried in Memphis. Most probably it was buried at somewhere like Saqqara. There was a sudden great interest in this particular part of the cemetery in perhaps the early Ptolemaic period. Why would there be a sudden flurry of building activity in an area which is a cemetery connected to Memphis at the time of Alexander's death, or thereabouts, in the area of the Serapeum? Could it be that it's because this is where Alexander's body was buried? We can't know this, but that is as good as it gets in terms of archaeological evidence.
And it's really interesting here, an incredible part of the story, which I believe, it is debated, but I believe. You will see in the British Museum today that there is an empty sarcophagus of Nectanebo II. Nectanebo II was the last native Egyptian ruler of Egypt. He was evicted by the Persians, where he fled into exile in around 342 BC, so roughly 20 years earlier than the events we're talking about now. But he died in exile. But they create their sarcophagi in advance of their death. So this empty sarcophagus was just lying there in Memphis. And Ptolemy, he's one for seeing opportunities. He thinks, now, if I put Alexander's body in the empty sarcophagus of Nectanebo II, well, that helps spring roots new stories which do eventually emerge of Alexander actually being the son of Nectanebo II. And so Alexander having this direct link to the last native pharaoh, which will ultimately help consolidate Ptolemy's rule over this incredibly important, incredibly historic land in the southeast Mediterranean.
What's really intriguing about this is that by the time it was observed by European travellers in modern times, the local folk story around this, the local sort of myth, was that it was the tomb of Alexander. Once it was clear this was the sarcophagus of Nectanebo, that story that it was the tomb of Alexander, of course, was rejected. But actually, this mythical connection between Nectanebo and Alexander makes it not entirely impossible that sarcophagus could have been at Memphis at the time Ptolemy was looking for a suitably grand monument, including a sarcophagus, to bury the king in, and that perhaps the body, even if it was only temporarily, was laid to rest in that sarcophagus.
The events of Perdiccas and Ptolemy, this is really the start of one of the most tumultuous periods in ancient history, which is the Wars of the Successors. Some people describe it as Antiquity's Game of Thrones. But basically, as these wars are going on elsewhere in the empire, Ptolemy stays in Egypt. And it's over 20 years later, like at the start of the 3rd century BC, that Ptolemy moves Alexander's body from Memphis to his new capital, Alexandria.
The likeliest story, I think, is that the body was temporarily in Memphis. It was moved to Alexandria. It was for a time in a tomb devoted entirely to Alexander until the time of Ptolemy IV, at which point this new mausoleum built to house a number of kings was built. If that's right, we have to assume that Alexander was buried effectively 3 times in different places in Egypt, once in Memphis and then twice in Alexandria. The best descriptions we have of any of these tombs relates to this mausoleum, the 3rd of the 3, the mausoleum built by Ptolemy IV. It was the kind of monument that was visitable, so it wasn't hidden, it wasn't sealed. The bodies were on display. We also know that it was possible to go and see Alexander's body as well, and that this seems to have been the main focal point of this. We are also told that this mausoleum was within the palaces district within Alexandria. Unfortunately, not enough of the archaeology of Ptolemaic Alexandria survives for us to be really clear about which building was where. And it's never been possible to identify a single scrap of evidence of the mausoleum itself. It may be, even today, that some parts of it have survived and are buried deep beneath probably a very, very busy highway running along the coast in Alexandria. But until we invent new techniques to allow us to see beneath concrete and tarmac, we have no trace of this tomb.
There are many theories as to what happened to Alexander the Great's body. Probably the most plausible, as we hear at that time, is really the rise of Christianity. And we know that many early Christian groups sometimes physically torch down, destroy pagan sites. And you've got to remember, Alexander's tomb, it was also a religious place. It was a place of pagan pilgrimage. So it makes sense that Alexander's tomb was also destroyed when the Christians destroyed the Serapeum in the late 4th century AD. There's one other possibility, that actually Christians sometimes destroyed pagan buildings, but they also sometimes converted them into churches. So it may well be that Alexander's tomb was converted into a church. There's a theory by Andrew Chugg that it became the Church of St. Mark. And there's a famous story that the body of St. Mark was later smuggled out of Alexandria by Venetian traders, and it is today in the centre of Venice. very much on display. Could that body be that of Alexander the Great? Who knows? Possibly.
Whenever there is a spectacular discovery of a tomb or a funerary monument in Alexandria, it's more or less always the first question people ask is, could it be something to do with Alexander the Great? So 2 or 3 years ago, we had the discovery of a monumental sarcophagus underneath the block of flats, which had just been demolished and the foundations were being relaid. It was indeed a previously unknown monumental sarcophagus of the late period or early Ptolemaic. So it was exactly the kind of thing you would be looking for, and it was sealed as well. The lid of the sarcophagus was lifted up, and it turned out to contain 3 bodies and a lot of sewage. Certainly not the tomb of Alexander the Great, but it just goes to show that people are still so excited at the possibility that it could be found that it's the first thing everybody wants to know. Is it the tomb of Alexander the Great? And it never has been so far. Well, I can't think of too many projects, potential archaeological projects in Egypt that I would rather be involved in if the funding were there and the opportunity was there to see beneath the streets. There is no doubt in my mind that there is a lot of Ptolemaic Alexandria still underneath the modern city. Whether or not the tomb of Alexander is going to be there, I don't know. It would be worth risking, a lot, if you like, for the possibility of finding that tomb.
How special an occurrence is it that a corpse is fought over? This incredible time, this incredible story. There are some really interesting examples, some parallels in history where we see these figures who are considered great men, particularly by their contemporaries, where their bodies, following their death, are just as important to the people who surround them as the person themselves when they were alive. And a key example here, I believe, is the figure of Napoleon. He died on St. Helena, but on a later date, his body was taken back to France, and the tomb you can now see in the centre of France. And it's really this emphasis how these figures can be just as important dead as they were alive.
I think the story of Alexander's death and burial speaks very much to the unprecedented importance and influence that he had in his time. Nobody had ever reigned over such a huge territory and then died at such a young age. You can think of parallels from elsewhere where there would probably have been greater clarity about who was going to take over, whereas there is just none at the time of Alexander's death. Hence this 2-year stalemate when nobody knows what's going to happen. And the death and burial, the how and the where and the who, is absolutely crucial to what's going to happen to Alexander's empire. And that is absolutely crucial to what's going to happen in what was the whole of the known world at that time for generations to come. So his death and burial are among the most important events from anywhere in the ancient world.
It was one of the biggest revolts in British history, a massive insurrection aimed at driving the Romans out of Britain through blood and battle. At its head was an elusive, unique warrior queen. Her name has become immortalised down through the centuries: Boudica.
The year was 60 AD. The Roman Empire dominated the Mediterranean and beyond, stretching from modern-day Wales in the northwest to Syria and Armenia in the east. And one of the most infamous figures in ancient history then sat on Rome's imperial throne, Nero. It would be during Nero's reign that several areas of the Roman Empire experienced severe unrest, not least in Britain. I'm in Colchester, the original capital of the Roman province of Britannia, and a place with close, infamous links to Boudica's revolt.
It had been almost 20 years since the initial Claudian invasion of Britain under Aulus Plautius, and since then the Romans had undergone a series of successful breakout campaigns, extending their influence further onto the island of Britain. And this had been successful through a variety of methods. First of all, through military means, through victories against famous British resistance leaders such as Caratacus, but also through some cunning diplomacy, through the handing out of substantial bribes to powerful native British rulers in the south, east and north of Britain to ensure that they remained peaceful as Rome looked to expand its control further west.
One key British ruler at this time was a king called Prasutagus.
Prasutagus was the king of the Iceni, situated roughly in about modern-day Norfolk in East Anglia. And we hear from our sources that Prasutagus, by AD 60, he had been reigning for quite a long time. He was considerably wealthy. And these two factors are probably very much linked to his close connections with Rome. Remember those substantial bribes, as I mentioned earlier, that the Romans gave out to powerful native British rulers? Well, Prasutagus was almost certainly one of those. Now, Prasutagus, he had two daughters and a wife, a queen, who we know today as Boudica. The name Boudica, it derived from the Celtic word Buda, which meant victory. And according to our sources, she was quite a character.
To find out more, I met up with Dr. Shushma Malik.
The main thing we have about Boudica's appearance comes from Cassius Dio, who was writing quite a lot later, sort of early 3rd century AD, so you're talking 250 years after these events. He tells us that she was clever for a woman, so that's something perhaps, but also that she was very wild in her appearance. She wore a multicoloured tunic and she carried a big spear. He makes a point to say that not only is it her physical appearance, but her voice as well is fierce.
In AD 60, Prasutagus died. In his will, he left his kingdom to his two young daughters, but also to the Roman Emperor Nero. It was Prasutagus' intention that, on the one hand, he preserved the Iceni's identity, he preserved the royal family, but also to keep the Romans happy. It was not to be, because enter our next protagonist, Catus Decianus, or Catus Decianus. Now, Catus was one of the most prominent Roman officials in Britain at that time. He was the Roman procurator. He was in charge of the administration of the finances. And with Prasutagus' passing, Catus sensed opportunity. With the Iceni seemingly in paralysis following the death of their king, Catus decided that this was the perfect time to strike.
Catus maintained that the money the Romans had previously given to Prasutagus was to be repaid with interest. Prasutagus and other local leaders had received money from the emperor, but also from another prominent figure in the imperial regime, Seneca.
So what's the story of Seneca's loans?
So that's an interesting story. Cassius Dio talks about this again, and he says that Seneca lent the British people a large amount of money, and actually Cassius Dio sees financial reasons as the main motivation for the Boudican revolt in the first place. Seneca lent the Britons about 40 million sesterces, which is a lot of money in Roman terms. So if you think that you need 1 million sesterces to be a Roman senator, but the daily wage for an unskilled labourer is about 4 sesterces. So we're talking huge amounts of money here. But what Seneca did was recall these loans very quickly, and he wanted all of the money back at once. And that was one of the reasons why the Boudican revolt took place.
What followed was an infamous act by the Romans. Centurions, alongside subordinates of Catus, slaves and lower officials, stormed into the Iceni territory. They sacked, they robbed, they looted. The Iceni aristocracy lost their ancestral lands. They were treated as if they were a slave race, as if they were a subject people. And even worse was to follow for the Iceni royalty themselves. Boudica was flogged, her 2 daughters were raped.
The Romans had opted to ignore Prasutagus' will, a decision they made emphatically clear through their pillaging of Iceni territory. But these infamous actions would have consequences. The Iceni were enraged, particularly their aristocracy and the ruling class. At their head was the mistreated Boudica, riling her people up for revolt to drive the Romans out of Britain.
So tell me about this remarkable speech of Boudica's in Cassius Dio.
So Cassius Dio gives her a very long speech, compared to Tacitus anyway, which is brilliant because it's a masterpiece of rhetoric, really, that he constructs for her and puts into the mouth of a woman, which is, of course, unusual, really. She starts off by talking about the freedom and the slavery that's been imposed on the British by the Romans. So do the British want their freedom back? This is the moment where they can take back their freedom. Even when you die, she says, you are still indebted to Rome. You're still having to pay them money in your wills. You've been paying taxes all your life, and then you're leaving your money to the Romans as well. Then she goes on from the freedom subject to talking about how actually if the British had just got rid of Julius Caesar back in the 50s BC, they wouldn't be in this scenario to begin with, but now was their time to redress that wrong. She then finishes the speech in an extraordinary way where she does an ad hominem attack on Nero. She says Nero is more of a woman than he is a man. She decides to rename him to Domitia Nero, Mistress Domitia Nero, which is the feminine version of Domitius, which was his birth name. So she really does then go for the jugular of Nero, if you like, which we don't see in comparable sources in Tacitus, for example. And that is a very interesting way of characterising the motivations and the impetus for the revolt as well. It's about Roman suppression in the province, but it's also about what's going on in Rome, and it also serves to make Boudica the more masculine of the two between her and Nero. So he may be a man and she may be a woman, but he is feminine and she is masculine.
Boudica became this rallying point for all of those who felt rightly aggrieved by the recent inhumane, greedy actions of the Romans. And Boudica too, of course, had suffered in those recent actions. But now her message was clear. It was time to strike back. People flocked to Boudica. The Iceni aristocracy, strongholds, and thousands of tribesmen. This was an astonishing amount of British unity, all united by a shared hatred of the Romans and a desire to expel them from the island. If the Romans believed that the death of Prasutagus would be the end of the Iceni and that the Iceni would simply accept their new subordinate status, they were gravely mistaken. Game on. Boudica started gathering her forces at a very opportune time. At that time, the most powerful Roman military force in Britain was hundreds of miles away to the west in modern-day Wales, led by our next key protagonist, the most powerful, most important Roman in the province of Britannia then, Suetonius Paulinus. Newly instated as the governor of Britain, Paulinus carried with him a wealth of military experience. He had previously led an expedition across the Atlas Mountains in North Africa, so he was the perfect choice to complete the conquest of Wales. So far, Paulinus had gained some spectacular success on campaign in the northern part of Wales. He had reached as far as the island of Anglesey, where the Britons had retreated to. It was a very important place for the Britons. But Paulinus, his campaign continued to gain success. He even burnt down the all-important sacred groves. Now, could the burning of these sacred groves and the beginning of Boudica's revolt be linked? It is possible that Boudica did have religious links. One thing for certain, though, is that Boudica struck at a very opportune time.
Boudica's first target was the nearby Roman town of Camalodunum, today's Colchester.
Camalodunum was the provincial heart of Roman Britain. Indeed, it was the provincial capital. This had been where the Emperor Claudius had visited almost 20 years earlier to receive the surrenders of British chiefs at the end of the initial invasion. And since then, Camalodunum, it had transformed. It had become the first Roman town in Britain and was the only official Roman colony on this island at the time of Prasutagus' death in 60 AD. Now, it was also here at Camalodunum that the Romans had settled a large quantity of soldiers, veterans who may well have served in the initial Claudian invasion of Britain, and who also infamously partook in the pillaging, in the raiding of Iceni territory in the immediate aftermath of Prasutagus' death. But Camalodunum was also home to a specific structure, a particular building that enraged the nearby Britons, a monumental structure that epitomised, that evoked, that symbolised Rome's newfound supremacy over this part of the island. This was the Temple of Claudius. It was dedicated to Claudius because following his death, he was deified. And as a result, we see this monumental construction appearing at the heart of Camalodunum. This temple was a source of social tension with nearby Britons. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, it lay before the Britons' eyes as a bastion of everlasting domination, a reminder of Rome's supremacy over that part of the island. But this wasn't the only Roman architectural hallmark that we see at Camalodunum. We also hear of a curia here at that time, a Roman courthouse, as well as a theatre. And all of these buildings combined, it made Camalodunum look like it was transforming into very much a Roman-looking town. And that's incredibly significant when you think that barely 20 years earlier, the Claudian invasion had occurred. Camalodunum back then had been this prominent British stronghold, but now it had become this urban symbol of Rome's rapidly growing influence over this part of the island.
It's also important to remember that it wasn't just Romans who lived in Camalodunum. Britons too lived in the town, those who were more inclined either to adopting or adapting to certain aspects of Roman culture. By 60 AD, Camalodunum had an estimated population of roughly 4,000. It was a prosperous settlement, but it was ill defended. It lacked substantial fortifications. It had ditches, but it did not have a wall. Camalodunum was an obvious target for Boudica.
As Boudica and her army gathered, bad omens plagued Camalodunum. We hear of shrieks and wails from the theatre. The Statue of Victory supposedly fell over, it toppled over, and then once on its side, it then rolled over again as if it was retreating for an oncoming enemy. They told stories that people saw apparitions, they saw visions of Camalodunum burning in the waters of the Thames estuary. Now, how much can we believe of these ancient bad omens? Well, they probably likely didn't happen. The Romans were renowned for inventing these bad omens to precede an infamous moment in their history. But what's interesting is how we're told the people of Camalodunum prepared for the impending threat from Boudica. They sent out calls for aid. One was sent to the procurator, Catus Decianus, who is then situated in London, Londinium. But Catus, he seems to have misunderstood, not realised the severity of the threat that Boudica posed, so much so that he only sent 200 improperly armed soldiers to aid the defence. But the people of Camalodunum, they also sent a request for aid to the nearest legion in Britain. And this was the famous 9th Legion, Legio IX Hispana, then stationed at modern-day Lincoln, ancient Linden. Now, the distance between Colchester and Lincoln is pretty significant, but there was a silver lining because in AD 60-61, we believe that there were detachments of the 9th stationed closer by near modern-day Peterborough. And it was probably to these detachments that the people of Colchester sent their call for aid. In the meantime, they started constructing a ditch and a rampart around the outside of Camalodunum, but it all proved too little, too late. By the time Boudica and her army arrived outside Colchester, the Romans had abandoned any fortifications which they had created really outside the centre of the settlement. And this was because, we are told, a British 5th column working from within Colchester had been hindering the defences to such an extent that the Romans had retreated to the Temple of Claudius, which was then the strongest structure in Camalodunum itself. Now, you need to imagine the scenes because we are told that among the soldiers there were also women, there were children, there were the old, there were the people who you wouldn't associate as being on the front line of combat action. But by retreating to the Temple of Claudius, the Romans abandoned the rest of the settlement. Boudica and her army wreaked havoc. The city was razed, the town was sacked, fire would have been everywhere. Archaeologists today, looking at the soil, looking at the stratigraphy, can see a clear burnt layer which they dub Boudica's layer because it may relate to when Boudica and her army razed this settlement to the ground. As for those defenders within the temple itself, they resisted for 2 days, but ultimately they too were overwhelmed. What followed was a merciless slaughter. None were spared. If they were unlucky enough to be taken captive, they were quickly executed soon after. Boudica's first target was accomplished. Camalodunum, this hated symbol of Rome's dominance, Rome's influence over this part of the island, was no more.
The Romans recoiled from the destruction of the provincial capital, but another disaster was quick to follow.
As already mentioned, part of the 9th Legion, Legio IX Hispana, were stationed quite close to Camalodunum, and in the meantime the 9th's legate, Petilius Cerealis, had been gathering troops, preparing an expedition to march southeast and to relieve the pressure on the provincial capital. It proved all too little too late. By the time Cerealis and his relief force neared Camalodunum, the settlement was already in ruins, victim of Boudica's onslaught. It would be this understrength portion of Legio IX Hispana, the 9th Legion, that would face the full fury of Boudica's army. What followed next was a catastrophe for the 9th. The relief force was attacked on the march by Boudica's army as they neared Camalodunum and were annihilated. Cerealis and only a portion of his cavalry managed to escape the slaughter, but the damage had been done. Boudica had gained her next military success.
For the Romans, news of the destruction of part of the 9th Legion, alongside the sacking of Camalodunum, was devastating. Catus, the procurator who had helped fan the fires of this insurrection, fled Britain, fleeing across the Channel to Gaul. But as Catus departed, a new hope for the Romans reached the southeast: Suetonius Paulinus. Upon hearing of the revolt, Paulinus had hurried back from Anglesey with his army, gathering more soldiers en route. Now in Londinium, the Romans and their allies looked to his leadership.
London at that time, it was a prosperous economic hub, home to roughly 10,000 people. But one key thing it lacked was fortifications. It didn't have a wall. It wasn't meant to be a defensive bastion, something Suetonius desperately needed if he was going to defend this town from Boudica and a much larger army. So Suetonius, he decided to abandon the town. He would retreat north, taking with him as many of his soldiers as possible and gathering more troops on the way. He would also take from London as many people as he could who could fight. But those who couldn't fight, women, the children, the old, they were all left behind. They begged Suetonius to stay. They begged the governor to fight for the town. But Suetonius' mind was made up. London was sacrificed. Boudica and her army showed London no mercy. They sacked the settlement and they executed anyone who they captured. According to Tacitus, thousands were executed by either being hanged, by being crucified, or being burnt alive. Cassius Dio goes into even more graphic detail. He mentions how some who were captured were melted alive in boiling water. But the worst fate befell the Romano-British and the Roman noble women. Those who were captured, they were taken to the sacred groves where they had their breasts cut off, according to Cassius Dio, sewn into their mouths before they were impaled through the whole length of their bodies. So far, the Romans had suffered several severe setbacks, but Suetonius now set about consolidating what strength he had. He had the 14th Legion, he had detachments of the 20th, and he also had a substantial number of auxiliaries. It was quite a significant force, but it was then that Suetonius encountered his latest setback. Perennius Postumus, the commander of the 2nd Legion stationed down in Exeter, he refused to march his legion to Suetonius' aid. He opted instead for them to stay within the safety of their legionary fortress down in the southwest. And the same story was similar for Cerealis and what remained of the 9th Legion. He opted to stay with the remnants of the 9th in their legionary fortress at Lincoln. So Suetonius, seemingly abandoned by these two legionary commanders, he had roughly 10,000 men with which to oppose the mighty army of Boudica.
As Suetonius gathered his forces, Boudica was already in pursuit, having left London a smouldering ruin. On her way, she set her sights upon at least one other settlement that she thought had been too friendly towards the Romans. This was Verulamium, modern-day St. Albans. Many Britons lived in this settlement. For Boudica, it seems that her revolt had turned into a war of ethnic cleansing, aimed at eradicating not just the Romans, but also all Britons who, in her eyes, had sided with Rome. Boudica's army arrived at Verulamium and destroyed it.
By this point, Boudica's army was huge compared to that of Suetonius. The Romans were the clear underdogs, the Britons were confident. But Suetonius, despite being greatly outnumbered, he knew he could delay no longer. it was time to fight. Suetonius knew that if he wanted to battle Boudica, then he wanted a battle on his terms. And so he selected a battleground which best suited his soldiers. He positioned them on a slightly elevated piece of land, its rear protected by thick woodlands. But it was what lay in front that was most important. In the distance was a large open plain, but in front of that, and just before Suetonius' position, was a narrow defile, steeply wooded on either side. Suetonius recognized that this was a potential killing zone. It was through this defile that any attacking army would have to charge if they were to reach the Roman position. In the centre of his line, he deployed his crack elite troops, his Roman legionaries, flanked on either side by auxiliaries and finally the cavalry. And we have this deployment on good authority because our main source for the battle is the Roman historian Tacitus. And one of the sources that Tacitus was using was his father-in-law Agricola, who may well have served as an aide of Suetonius at this climactic clash. In the meantime, as this deployment was going on, the Britons had gathered on the plain in unprecedented numbers. They were highly confident. They believed victory was near at hand. And so confident were they that many had brought along their wives, their pack animals, their wagons, in order to spectate what they believed would be the final decisive success in their mission to expel the Romans from Britain.
As the Britons assembled, Boudica emerged in front of her warriors, ready to rile them up for battle with an emphatic speech.
So what do we know about this speech by Boudica before the Battle of Watling Street?
So this speech comes to us from Tacitus, who's writing in about the early 2nd century AD, so a bit earlier than Cassius Dio. This is quite a different speech that Tacitus gives Boudica compared to Cassius Dio's. She's in her chariot this time, she's not standing with her spear in front of the troops, but with her in her chariot are her daughters. And it seems like she goes to each of the tribes individually and talks to them about being led by a woman. So she reassures them first of all that it's okay that they can be led by a woman, there's precedence for this, which suggests perhaps there's some differences in the reactions between the tribes. But then she goes on to talk about how she has been beaten personally by the Romans, how they've raped her daughters. It's the physical assault to her that is motivating this action. But also she talks about the broader pollution that's being done to Britain by the Romans. So the beating of other people and the savagery of the Romans is polluting Britain. So this makes it a religious argument as well as a moral argument, and therefore expands that out to the tribes, as well as her own personal reasons for going against the Romans.
Fact or fiction? I like to think that when Boudica finished her speech, a huge roar erupted among the Britons. We're told in Tacitus in response, Suetonius had his own speech for his Roman soldiers. He highlights how, yes, Boudica's army, they had the numbers, they had the quantity, but the Romans, they had the battle experience, they had the skill, they had the quality. And Suetonius' speech was generally as follows: stay alert, keep your discipline, listen to orders, and we will overcome. But for the Romans, there was another factor at play. By this time, Boudica and her army's infamous reputation must have preceded them. The sacking of at least 3 settlements, the annihilation of part of a Roman legion. The Romans must have known that if they were to see the sun rise, to see the sun set another day, then they had to overcome. They had to win.
The Britons attacked. They charged up the narrow defile, marching up through the valley, no doubt clamouring and shouting as they approached their enemy. But the Romans stayed where they were. Closer and closer the Britons came to their position. Still, the Romans refused to move. Then, at the given signal, all hell was unleashed.
Each Roman legionary had two specially designed javelins called pila, and as the British approached, the legionaries took out their first pilum, a lighter, longer range javelin, took them back, aimed the javelin and threw them down on the approaching British. Then soon after, they took out their second javelin, a heavier pilum, shorter range but more deadly, equipped with a lead weight. The legionaries aimed their heavier javelins and threw that down in a second volley on the approaching British. Now, as many of the Britons would have been lightly armoured, these missile volleys would have been devastating. And as the Britons were regaining their composure in the wake of this rain, this hailstorm of missiles, then the Roman legionaries went into action. They locked up their large rectangular scutum shields, they took out their short gladius swords, they formed a wedge formation and they charged downhill into the British ranks. On either side they had their auxiliaries with their oval shields, with their spears, similarly joining in the charge with all might and vigour. The Britons, their numbers, the huge quantity of soldiers now worked to their disadvantage. The Roman tactics, combined with the terrain, had turned them from predators into prey. At this crucial juncture, when British morale was wavering, Suetonius dealt the hammer blow. He sent his cavalry in on the sides into this great mass of British soldiers. That was it for the Britons. They turned and fled down into the narrow defile, pursued by the Romans, having received orders to show no mercy. The Britons emerged onto the plain. They struggled to get past the wagons, their pack animals, their wives watching on as they tried to escape the slaughter. But for many, it was to no avail. What followed was a horrific bloodbath. Suetonius had pulled off a remarkable but bloody victory. Indeed, when Poenius Postumus, the commander of the Second Legion, when he heard of this great victory gained by Suetonius, he committed suicide out of shame. Remember, it was Postumus who had refused to march his legion to Suetonius' aid earlier in the revolt. As for casualties from the battle itself, Tacitus tells us that some 400 Romans lost their lives in the battle. The Britons, meanwhile, Boudica's army, lost up to 80,000.
As for Boudica, her fate is less clear.
There are two different versions of this story of what happens to Boudica. The Battle of Watling Street has been absolutely brutal. It is a massacre. Not only did the troops die on the British side, but also the women and baggage animals as well are slaughtered too. Tacitus says that at the end of this, Boudica committed suicide. She takes poison, in fact, which speaks to her character as a female. Actually, it's women who use poison in this method. Think of Cleopatra, for example. We also get then the alternative version of history from Cassius Dio, who actually says, yes, this was a horrific battle, but there were still some Britons ready to carry on if they could be led by Boudica. So some managed to escape. They were looking to Boudica for leadership, and unfortunately Boudica got sick and she died from her illness. So this is a very different version of the story from Cassius Dio, who again has a very different motivation for wanting to give Boudica perhaps a more masculine death.
Rome learnt its lessons from the revolt. Iceni territory was absorbed into the Roman province. To assure security, military structures were constructed north of the Thames. Colchester was rebuilt and finally received its own wall. The Boudican revolt was a wake-up call for the Romans, deadly proof that southern Britain had not yet been fully pacified. Paulinus was brutal in the aftermath of Watling Street, but his reprisals only served to stir up the chance of another rebellion. Seeing this, the new procurator, Classicianus, sent word to the Emperor Nero, who in turn sent his own official to Britain to end the reprisals, a freedman called Polyclitus.
So this is interesting. This happens after the Battle of Watling Street, and we only get this from Tacitus. Cassius Dio isn't necessarily interested in the after effects of Watling Street. For him, Boudica's death is decisive. Polyclitus goes in, he has a very impressive sort of entry into the colony. He has a column of soldiers, and it's scary, it is scary. But when the Britons realise that he's a freedman, so had formerly been a slave and had been freed, they find him a laughing stock, because Tacitus says they don't understand how powerful a freedman could be. That there was this status in Rome. For them, it was all about either you were free or you're a slave. So for them, Polyclitus still had that mantle of slavery, and they found it difficult to take him seriously.
The revolt did ultimately peter out, thanks to a more lenient policy of a new Roman governor of Britain. Those Romano-British client rulers who had stayed loyal to Rome, who had decided not to aid Boudica in her revolt, well, they were rewarded. Perhaps the rulers at Fishbourne and at Caleva. Now, civilian rebuilding did occur in the aftermath, albeit slowly. In the immediate aftermath of the revolt, particularly for the areas around Colchester, around London, around St Albans, those settlements which Boudica had destroyed, well, the Romans put a strong focus on military building. The Romans were determined that revolts like Boudica's in southern Britain would never happen again.
Boudica's revolt had ended in failure. The Iceni warrior woman herself had lost her life. But Boudica's legacy lived on.
The story of Boudica is highly popular. It's become ingrained in British legend. I mean, it has it all. It has the wrongs warrior woman riling up a revolt against the superpower of the time and almost succeeding. But for me, what I find so fascinating about the revolt is the parallels we see between it with other events, roughly contemporary events we see elsewhere in the world. In the 1st century AD, in Vietnam, we see a similar revolt. Two sisters, the Trung sisters, leading an uprising, encouraging the Vietnamese to take up arms against their own dominant superpower, the Han dynasty of ancient China, which then dominated large parts of Vietnam. The Trung sister rebellion, like Boudica's revolt, ultimately ended in failure. But still, it's an incredible parallel.
The story that surrounds Boudica is one that we can see parallels with throughout world history. A figure thrown into an extraordinary position and making something of it. Taking on an imperial superpower and carving out significant success against all odds, only to ultimately be defeated. The story has inspired. The name holds steadfast among the annals of British folklore. The archaeology will discover more. The legacy will endure.